Good morning, everyone, or wherever you're sitting, good afternoon. Welcome to the first webinar of Savient. It's going to be the first ever in a series now that we want to hold over the next 12 months. We're happy to kick off the series with a topic that has been drawing a lot of attention in recent days. Especially around the topic with global markets opening up even more on a daily basis. The LEI, which is short for the legal entity identifier, is becoming more and more a fundamental identifier for corporate authentication, right? For transparency of parties involved in any financial or trade activity, it is a fundamental must-have performing any sort of action where two parties, in that case, two corporates, are involved. And with this webinar, we want to bring you closer to the topic. We will get an introductory understanding of the LEI, what the LEI is, and our guest speaker, Mr. Nathan, whom I will introduce in a bit, will guide us through the LEI history as well as the as-to-date status. My name is Ben. I'm the COO of the company, the COO of Savient. I am overseeing the daily operational business within the corporate, and I will now give you a short introduction about what Savient is doing, where we are operating, and I will then hand over to my colleague and one of the co-founders, Mr. Dennis O'Brien. Yes, so Savient is a UK-based financial technology company that provides cutting-edge, world-class treasury and trade solutions to small, medium, and large corporates. Savient provides solutions including cash management, cross-border payments, escrow, and agency services, as well as working capital solutions, and, as stated before, FX liquidity. We have a diverse clientele, and our customers are starting or ranging from SMEs to large multinational corporates in any jurisdiction around the world. Our goal is to create an easier, more efficient, cost-effective way to manage corporate financials and treasury activities, right? So anything that is on the daily to-do list of a financial department within the corporate, we want to cover this and make this accessible via the Savient platform and our ecosystem. Our products, from that perspective, are built for CFOs, treasurers, or simply just the one-man shows handling their day-to-day business, right? With that, we have created an ecosystem where, in a simple and easy accessible dashboard, you can see all your cash positions, and based on this and the product suite of Savient, you can make better financial decisions in your day-to-day business. As stated before, we are headquartered in the UK in London, and we started our operations by mid last year in West Africa, with Nigeria being our entry market. And we're looking forward to expand to other countries within the EMEA sector within the year. As mentioned in the introduction, in this webinar, we want to introduce a deep dive on the globally standardized entity identifier called LEI. And I would now hand over to my colleague and one of the co-founders, Mr. Dennis O'Brien, to give us a brief introduction around LEI before we then continue.
Thank you very much for that, Ben. On behalf of Savient and everybody associated with the company, we thank you all for your time and joining us this webinar. This is a product and a service which is very close to our heart. As we're all aware, working in the financial services industry, compliance is really key, and it's a cornerstone of really pretty much anything you do around your customers and your suppliers. I just want to briefly frame LEI and then hand over to Nathan, who's obviously the subject matter expert. But really, when you look at it, LEI is really considered the only globally standardized identifier. And anybody who works in compliance really understands that it requires quite a lot of work when you're onboarding a customer or a counterparty. And typically you run into a myriad of problems around contradictive data, old data or unreliable, unreadable, machine non-readable data as well, translation issues. There's a whole number of processes and procedures that can be affected by it. And if you look at it, on average, banks tend to use anywhere between 4 to 7 entity identifiers per entity when they onboard any customer on a global scale. I think LEIs are absolutely fundamentally crucial to anybody who's doing business in an emerging market, whether you're an SME or you're a large or global corporate. It really is your stamp for global digital identity. And in emerging markets, obviously the compliance infrastructure is not as advanced as it is in other markets, but LEI allows us to leapfrog and become to a global standard. And that allows us really access to the latest digital technology and identity technology that really will help people doing trade and transactions, especially cross-border, and also with counterparties. And transparency is absolutely key. And one of the great things, one of the powerful things we've noticed around LEI is that database. It's an open database, and it provides huge transparency on a global scale. And really, the whole supply chain, if it's LE&I enabled, gives you a lot of transparency and faster compliance. And if you look through a process going from an SME to a bank to a lender to a counterparty and to a vendor, if you have LEIs in your process flow, that can pretty much cut your due diligence by as much as 50% in terms of time. I think another very important point of the LEI is you've got over 294 global compliance regulations that accept or recommend the LEI. And increasingly, we're seeing countries actually adopt LEI as their standardized sort of identity process with banks, especially in countries like India, Australia, and even Europe as well are making a big push from this. And there's a lot of backing from global regulators and compliance organizations with LEI. So we're seeing a lot of backing from the ESCMA, FAFT, G20 nations, the Bank of England, European Central Bank, SWIFT, for example. So there's a lot of global compliance companies coming on board to really push this. But one of the things that we found interesting when we started speaking to Nathan and his team, then they began to educate us, is LEIs they're not really known on a global scale, and people really underestimate the importance of them. We appreciate that it's the inception of LEIs commenced in 2014, so that was, my maths, about 7-8 years ago, and obviously the ecosystem is expanding over time. But we're hoping that will start to accelerate, especially as LEIs get adopted on a countrywide scale, and then that hopefully will proliferate globally. There's a very interesting phrase that I learned yesterday from Nathan, and thank you for educating me on this, is within the ecosystem, they say no LEI, no trade. So increasingly, you're finding a lot of trading counterparties are asking for LEIs. And as I said before, it really gives your company that sort of rubber stamp of authenticity, which is increasingly important, especially in emerging markets. We're also seeing LEIs now being incorporated into digital trust solutions like SSL, DocuSign as well. And this gives you a further level of trust and enhancement. And if the moment we all notice is the moment you slip on non-compliance or your compliance is slightly off, especially when you're talking to big banks or global financial institutions, there's a lot of damage that can come around on your brand. So having that LEI and making sure that you keep up to date is very, very important. And one classic point on that is Coinbase actually got delisted from the Frankfurt Stock Exchange for reporting an incorrect LEI. So that just shows you the level of importance and seriousness that regulators and global institutions are taking LEIs as they should do. So I think I just wanted to frame that very succinctly and very briefly. And at this stage, I would like to hand over to Nathan Touré, who's been fantastic with us at Cevian in educating us. Nathan will obviously tell us a little bit about himself, but we're delighted to partner with Nathan and the company he represents, and we very much look forward to going on this compliance journey together. So without further ado, Nathan, I hand the floor to you and I'll go on mute.
Thanks, Dennis. So as Dennis rightly mentioned, a quick introduction about myself. I'm the Strategic Pilot Manager here at UbiSecure. I work with our global registration agent and validation agent networks, and generally trying to also support the Glyph with pushing the adoption of LEIs across the world. So I've got a small presentation to run through today with you guys. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Hopefully, Ben, would you give me a thumbs up if you can see that?
Yep, thumbs up. Yep.
Great, fantastic. Cool. Okay, so let's dive into the LEI and the history around it. Oh, am I in the wrong one? There we go. Great. So let's dive back quickly into the weekend of September 13th and 14th of 2008, which is also referred to as the Lehman weekend. Basically, this is where the Lehman Brothers and other financial institutions kicked off the global financial market crash by filing for bankruptcy and so on. This was basically due to lack of transparency, poor risk management, exposure to risky trades, mortgage-backed securities, lack of capital, and pretty much a failure of understanding of where they stood within the markets. So let's move forward into who's actually involved in the ecosystem. So back in 2009, the FSB, or the Financial Stability Board, was created. This was actually in a direct response to the global crash. Shortly after the FSB were created, along with the G20 nations backing, the LEI initiative was actually launched to tackle global systemic risk. Moving forward to LEI ROC in 2013, the LEI ROC was created as a governance body for the LEI system, basically helping regulators, standard bodies, and other organizations with the adoption of LEI and really trying to push the LEI into the 294 global compliance regulations that either mandate or recommend the use of LEI today. Along with the LEI ROC, you have the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, the Glyph. So in 2014, the Glyph were created as essentially the overall governing body of the LEI database. They support LEI issuers, they manage the data quality, and they manage all the concatenations and uploads of the LOU's validation. Moving forward, you also have the LOUs, so what's also known as a local operating unit or an LEI issuer. LEI issuers are the ones who actually perform the validation and issuance and management of LEIs on behalf of market participants. There are around 39 LOUs globally, of which only a handful actually issue LEIs to a global scale. Most generally tend to issue only to their own local regions. Moving forward from there, you also have the registration agents and validation agents. So these are approved organizations that work in partnerships with LOUs, or the LEI issuers, and provide registration and management services for market participants as well. So they essentially work on behalf of an LOU to provide local support, local payments, local currencies, and so on to local markets. Of course, you also have the 2.3 million legal entities that now have an LEI. I'll speak a little bit more about where the ecosystem is going in future and the kind of number goals that we have to reach, but that'll come later on. So what is the LEI itself? Just to recap, the LEI is a 20-digit alphanumerical code that is essentially split into 3 different areas. The first 4 digits are the LOU prefix, so this is an LOU identifier. As you can see on the bottom side, you have the 5299. This is the Rapid LEI or UbiSecure prefix. The middle 14 digits you have as the actual entity identifier. And then in the last 2 digits, you have the verification ID as described in the ISO 17442 standard, which is the LEI standard. So where are we today with the ecosystem? So there's 294 global compliance and regulations, as Dennis mentioned. So we are starting to see India, Australia, and even Europe starting to look at actually mandating the LEI cross-board. India released their first mandate last year. Their second mandate actually came in last week. and they also have a third mandate coming in 2024. Australia as well, with their digital identity initiatives, are looking at using the LEI in replacement over the AVID code, the local AVID code. I think Dennis also touched on a quite important statement there, is that the LEI is the only globally standardized legal entity identifier. So if you're a bank or an organization trying to onboard or understand a counterparty using local identifiers like tax IDs, business registry numbers, and so forth, then those are essentially useless when you're talking on a global scale, trying to understand, who is this company, who are they owned by, what risk does this company present. In the last 6 to 8 months, we've seen more of a change in the ecosystem or the market drivers towards the actual willing use of LEI. So people aren't just seeing it as a compliance burden. They're more seeing the LEI as, actually, if I have an LEI, I can now do X, Y, and Z. So this is basically stemmed from the use of LEI within KYC and AML, risk, client onboarding, and so forth. And the Glyph have done a lot of work with McKinsey and Company to generate reports, essentially showing the benefits, the key areas of benefits that the LEI provides. Again, just touching on a few facts that Dennis mentioned. The LEI is heavily recommended and even mandated in certain areas by big regulatory bodies like the FAFT, ESMA, EIOPA, G20 nations are also backing it. Bank of England, US Customs and Border Force are trialing the LEI as a key identifier for import and export. A few other ISO standards also support the use of LEI, along with MIFID, EMIR, Dodd-Frank, and all the other regulations that we've been talking about. So what problems have the LEI solved so far? Essentially, banking the unbanked is a nice term to use, enabling legal entities to have a global digital ID in order to trade, meet compliance regulations, and increase the stability in their financial markets. Again, just trailing back to what Dennis said, there's a famous saying in the ecosystem of no LEI, no trade. Essentially, the LEI helps legal entity of all sizes to identify themselves on a global scale. This is actually starting to move towards no LEI, no business, because the LEI is a common requirement when you're either being onboarded or whether you're trying to verify a counterparty. So all around the world, small and medium-sized enterprises, so SMEs, lack robust business credentials. As a result, millions of entities are struggling to access trade finance, create partnerships, particularly in developing economies, and this is a major obstacle impeding the growth of the global digital economy. So transparency, again, is a main thing that the LEI actually brings to the table here. So transparency leads to financial stability, reporting, and an easier time with compliance and regulations, which equals to essentially better risk management and less friction and better decisions. The Glyph, LEI Rock, and the McKinsey Company, as I mentioned, have done a lot of work on reports to show how the LEI actually helps organizations performing onboarding to save money, reduce friction, and make better decisions about how they interact with these types of entities. For example, the banks or organizations that are performing an onboarding service or a compliance service benefit from a value-added service, both internally but also for their customers, as they have an increased customer experience. There's quite an interesting article that the Glyph released with a McKinsey Company about how the LEI can save the global banking sector 2 to 4 billion annually in just client onboarding costs alone. So what are we as an LOU working on today to help drive the ecosystem forward? So we're actually working directly with the ICC, which is the International Chambers of Commerce. The ICC represent 45 million companies in over 100 different countries. They are focusing on the LEI within digital trade. Sorry, they are focusing on the LEI within digital trade and understand that it could represent a total annual saving of 224 billion. Business registry initiatives, we're also helping business registries understand the benefits of LEI and assigning a global digital ID at the inception of a legal entity. this then creates transparency from the start of that legal entity being developed. Validation agents, again, we mentioned we worked with a lot of banks. So banks and financial institutions are getting involved with the issuance and management of LEIs for the benefit of their own operations, as well as providing an improved service to their clients. As I quickly mentioned in the previous slide, the US Customs and Border Force are actually trialing the LEI as a global identifier in a pilot. So for import and export, which is good to see, because this is starting to see the adoption outside of the traditional financial markets. And VLEI, or verifiable LEI, is the next stage of the ecosystem. Essentially, this is working with technologies like SSI and other digital identity initiatives to enable the identity holder to have control of his and her personal data, and to when and whom that data is shared with. So we see verifiable credentials being a huge part of the system moving forward, and we're quite excited to be working on that initiative. So AML, risk, KYC, KYB, client onboarding, they all essentially benefit from the use of LEI due to transparency. Increased transparency equals data quality trust, digitally readable, so it can be shared across different departments and across different countries, and the LEI database being API enabled means that organizations can absorb the LEI database at a large scale. So the LEI also provides scalability when you're trying to understand the scope of the organization and what they need to do to onboard or verify counterparties. So I mentioned previously on my previous slide about client onboarding specifically, and the report Life did with McKinsey & Company. So the McKinsey & Company found that the LEI within certain areas of a bank, there's a lot of different areas that the LEI sits within a bank, but the LEI could generally save the global banking system 2 to 4 billion annually in just client onboarding, most of which that is people costs. It kind of whittles down to around 5 to 6 million per bank, simply from using the LEI in your client onboarding process. There was one thing I actually didn't touch on my last slide. Actually, the LEI within trade finance, as it's a trade webinar, essentially the trade finance would benefit from the use of LEI within the issuance of letters of credit and capital markets and so forth. The actual saving there represents around 500 million annually for the use of LEI in letters of credit alone. So just moving forward to this slide. Sorry about that. The LEI isn't just a compliance requirement. It's a highly assured organizational digital identity that is able to be used globally. So when you're talking about SMEs or small businesses that don't necessarily have the opportunity or chance to interact with the global financial markets, the LEI is also seen as the on-ramp for them to be able to meet those compliance regulations and meet the minimum standards in order to interact globally. So the LEI is organizational identity. The LEI creates so many more opportunities for adoption and transparency outside of the traditional financial markets. I'll quickly touch on this at the end, but UB Secure is an identity and access management firm. So we see the LEI as a core identity product for organizations to be able to identify themselves, identify the individuals, and then link those individuals to the organization to have really robust and streamlined processes for governance, authentication, authorization, and delegation, and so forth. So the VLEI essentially represents the next step of the ecosystem, creating the ability to identify individuals, organizations, customers, workforce, vendors, etc. All essentially, it streamlines all of the governance controls. It streamlines all the secure authorization side of things, the access management. It improves the user experience for both the customers and workforce and those trying to interact in between. So why is the LEI actually so helpful? This is a couple of snippets from the actual LEI database, if you haven't already been on there yourselves. So the LEI is actually a history book of a company. It captures all of the changes, updates from the data, when that change was made. And the LEI is also renewed every year. So when an LEI lapses, it will actually come up, well, before it lapses, it will come up for renewal. If it doesn't renew, then it will lapse. So if you're interacting with an entity that has a lapsed LEI, it will be an instant red flag to say, hey, this data is not the latest and greatest, and this could represent some risk. So I like to say the LEI is almost like a one-stop shop to completely understand who you're dealing with, who owns these companies, who owns the legal entity, and where these entities are registered. So as you can see, it captures the primary legal names, it captures where the registered address is, where it's registered at, the entity legal form, so what type of company this is. And as we move forward, you also see that we capture a lot more information in there as well. So the LEI and other local identifiers also benefit from the database because they're able to tie their own identifiers to the LEI and also benefit from that transparency there. So you have the BIC code, the ISIN code, and also recently the S&P Global Company ID was added to the LEI system, again, to really drive transparency and adoption across different areas. At the bottom here, you also see we validate the addresses and the headquarters at the local business registries. So all of the information in the LEI should be the absolute latest and greatest non-replicable data from the business registry. Moving forward, you also have what I like to think of is as the main benefit of the LEI and the real reason why the LEI kind of towers over the other local identifiers that are out there. It actually captures the relationship structure of this organization. So you have parents, you have direct parents, you have ultimate parents, direct children, ultimate children, branch relationships, funds. You know, the overall organizational structure can be really complex. So what the LEI does is essentially brings all that information in, and it's one page to understand exactly who this company is, where they're based, who they're owned by, what relationships does it have, and just gives you all of that, you know, really nitty-gritty information that you need to understand exactly who this person is and why you're trying to do business with them. So finally, as I mentioned earlier, the next stage of the ecosystem is the verifiable LEI, so VLEI, and this is the last stage of the thing that was missing almost. We're now able to tie individuals to organizations to show that they are actually able to act on behalf of an organization. So as you can see here on the snippet, you have the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, so the GLIFES LEI here, but you also have Stefan Wolf, who is the CEO, publicly displayed to say, I am able to act as a CEO on behalf of this company. So a quick introduction as to who we are. There was a press release this morning that was rolled out between us and Cevian to share a bit more detailed on our partnership, but a quick introduction from our side at least is that we are an identity and access management organization. We are also an LEI issuer, so as an LOU. We're now serving more than 200,000 legal entities, and we're number one in the ecosystem for data quality, volume of issuance, speed of issuance, and transfers into our management. Our vision as a company, as an identity company, is to tie both the individual and the organization together and to essentially create transparency and security for all those who are interacting with that organization, whether you're a customer, a workforce, a vendor, a counterparty, contractor, you know, so forth. That's where our focus is, and obviously the organizational identity, i.e. the LEI, is a real crucial part of that. Cevian is actually an official registration agent of the LEI ecosystem, so they're approved by GLIFE, and they work with Rapid LEI directly, so we can help them provide the backend system for them to provide the LEI services through their treasury platform. So just a quick closing statement. The G20, the FSB, LEI ROC, GLIFE, They've all made public statements to drive the LEI ecosystem to 20 million by 2027. Currently, as I mentioned at the beginning of this slide, the status is 2.3 million plus at the moment. So over the next few years, we should see a lot more LEIs coming out into the ecosystem, and we believe this is going to be rolled out by banks and the VLEI, which will be interesting to see how that comes out. And the last thing I wanted to make was the LEI was a direct reaction to the Lehman weekend to help organizations understand, where their risks lie, how they're acting as an organization, and what risks they essentially are presented with. And just to close out the slide, I wanted to highlight the inclusion for legal entities in emerging markets. It creates that digital ID, it creates the global scalability and the global transparency that those emerging markets and small SMEs who are wanting to trade on a global scale, it really is that on-ramp for them to be able to do what they need to and grow the local markets. So, my last slide isn't working. No. So the next slide essentially was just a thank you for listening and opening the floor to any questions.
Well, Nathan, thank you very much for that oversight. That was extremely useful. I found that very informative as well. We've got a number of people on the webinar. I believe that the chat box is open for any questions that anybody would like to ask. But I think I'll start with one very simple one. I think it would be very. We can see some questions coming in hopefully. But I think my first one is from a practical point of view. What does one actually have to do to obtain an LEI? I mean, what documentation does one need to provide? What's the sort of process?
Sure.
I think that'd be very useful for our listeners to understand. How do you actually go about obtaining one from a sort of step-by-step process?
Sure. So essentially, there's three different areas that you could acquire an LEI. First being you're going to a bank and you're trying to be onboarded by this bank, and the bank is a validation agent, for example. That means the bank has the approved ability to leverage their existing KYC and client onboarding workflows to then actually issue an LEI based off of that information to you. So you could be a business trying to be onboarded by a bank, and they would actually issue an LEI to you. The second one would be that an organization requires an LEI due to X, Y, and Z regulation, like MiFID, for example. And this legal entity could then go to a registration agent who is able to offer streamlined registration services and cheap, easy management portals and so forth. The last one being you could actually go to an LOU directly, like a UbiSecure or the others, and you could get your LEI directly from them. So the actual application process is quite simple. Essentially, the LOU would really only need the company name or company number, the jurisdiction of which the legal entity is in, and the signing director, so who is able to sign on behalf of this organization. So with those few bits of information that we have been provided by the client, we can then go to that local business registry. We can then confirm all the data that we have found on that entity in that local business registry and present that to the client. They can simply just approve or deny that the information is the latest and greatest, and most of the time, because it's from the registry, it's approved. So as soon as it's approved, we can issue the LEI. So it's a validation process on our side to ensure that the data that we are issuing and making a public statement on is correct at the business registry.
And I think the other one I was gonna ask on behalf of the audience is, so if let's say I'm counterparty A and you're counterparty B, and we're going to initiate a trade transaction between ourselves, and typically you have onboarding and KYC, KYB processes in place. If I send you an LEI, does that suffice, or do I have to send all of my existing corporate documentation as well, or is the LEI pretty much that rubber stamp to say, okay, counterparty A's got an LEI, he's registered officially, that passes compliance automatically?
So the system's moving towards the ability of just accepting the LEI as that sole rubber stamp or identifier for that organization. I think today, because there's so much history where the required documents need to be on hand and so many paper-based processes need to be followed. I don't think the LEI is a sole can be solely used today, but there's certainly areas of where that is definitely moving towards. So, for example, the UK, where we're working with the ICC on the UK Digital Trade Bill. Essentially, all that means is the change of some simple wording within the law to say that these trade documents need to be paper-based. Now, the update to that wording is essentially these documents can be digital, and the ICC are now heavily recommending that the digitalization of that can be the LEI to show that this organization is who they say they are and a legitimate organization. So, a short answer to your question is yes, we're getting there. That you can use the LEI just solely for that counterparty identification, but I'm not 100% if that is widely trusted today.
I think probably another important point to note: if you work in a high risk or high risk jurisdiction, the LEI gives some further comfort. I think this one's more of a comment than a question, but I noticed last week that Nigeria and South Africa have been put on the grey sanctions list, which is not necessarily a sort of a doom rule. It's not the blacklist, as it were, but it's basically saying we've identified some gaps. You're a high risk sort of money laundering sort of country. You've got a few gaps in your processes that need closing, and you're addressing them. But in the meantime, we're sort of putting you on that grey list just to say that we've got your eye on you. And I think LEIs or with companies who do run bona fide businesses and run an honest business, the LEI will just give some further comfort around that to say, well, whilst the processes in the country may not be up to scratch, us as a business, we're doing everything that we can. And by the way, one of the tech points that we've done is we've registered with the global LEI database, and our documentation is in order.
Exactly, and in order for those organizations to actually receive an LEI, obviously the LOU that does the validation ensures that this company is exactly who they say they are, and the signing directors match and so forth. So exactly to your point, fraudulent companies will be deterred to get an LEI because of the validation procedures that undergo that actually happen when the LEI is issued. So if you're an organization that is in an emerging market, or you're in these areas where certain sanctions have been put on, then an LEI would just strengthen your company's reputation and ability to trade on global markets.
Okay. And then another one, I suppose, is probably around timeline, and that's probably so how long is a piece of string question, because obviously it depends on the documentation that's provided. But when a company submits their documentation, for an LEI request, the typical turnaround time to say, okay, we can issue, are we talking hours, days, weeks?
So the Rapid LEI ecosystem is in a quite unique position compared to other LOUs. So Stephen, for example, will also benefit from this as a registration agent with Rapid LEI. Our platform is directly linked to the business registries around the world. So we have API capabilities into different registries, and we're able to pull the information from that registry via our API. This in turn allows us to issue LEIs via API in same session. So, for example, if you're a bank or someone wanting to run an AML check or a KYC check on a client that you're onboarding, then customers of Ubisco and Rapid LEI and Cevian will almost be able to receive that LEI in seconds to help them move forward with the rest of the onboarding workflows and AML processes and so forth. So essentially, if we're given all the right data and all the information that we've validated is correct, then we can issue an LEI pretty much instantly or within a few minutes. If there's some back and forth or misunderstanding of what this data actually represents, then there could be a little bit back and forth, and that might delay the actual issuance by an hour or so. But generally, the Rapid LEI network tends to issue LEIs in automated jurisdictions within a few seconds or minutes, and those that aren't within a few hours. But we tend to make sure that all of our LEIs are issued same day as a worst case.
Yeah, I know from our point of view, Ben, and I know that you've now automated our platform. So our clients that we've onboarded now, we're issuing LEIs through our system, and I think we've managed to keep that in under a day as well. And that's also, I suppose, speaks to the power of the sort of API technology that UbiSecure and ourselves have, really, about making things easier for your clients.
Definitely. I mean, it's the only scalable way forward, having APIs in place, really. You could have large teams trying to manage this on a global scale, but it's not the scalable way forward. So APIs and technology and use of AI and so forth is definitely the best way moving forward. And just to touch a little bit on data quality as well. So the reason why Rapid LEI is also number one in the ecosystem for data quality and our arrays as well, is because we have these direct links via API to these business registries. So there's no human error, there's no misspellings or misunderstanding between translations. We'll pull that information directly from that business registry and enter that into the LEI. So there's no room for error on our side, and that's why we have a 99.99% data quality standard.
So you're helping to remove fat finger syndrome.
Exactly.
I think the other one for me is what's the most interesting business case you've seen of an LEI being used? Anything sort of out of the box, or because obviously it's in different parts of the world now, so people obviously use technology in different ways. Regulations differ slightly in different markets, but what's the most interesting way you've seen an LEI being used?
So it's not in play today, but the most interesting one I've seen people working on is actually the LEI and using that as an ID to mint NFTs. So people are wanting to tie the VLEI and the organizational identity to non-fungible tokens, NFT, and actually have a real-world identifier to show who owns this picture or who owns this this image. So that was quite an interesting conversation to have. Yeah.
So LEI is actually being used in an unregulated world, in the crypto world. That's interesting.
It's starting to go in there. Yeah, especially as the launch of VLEI comes out with verifiable credentials, people are starting to want to actually tie the VLEI credential of who this person is, how they're able to act on behalf of the company, and obviously the company identity as well, and then tie that to like an organizational wallet. So if you're thinking about open banking or something like that, you can have approved globally transparent individuals that are able to access wallets or make payments and make transactions and stuff like that. So in the terms of trade, the VLEI will be the one to hopefully revolutionize how the trade finance works and how people understand counterparties.
And I think so. One final question for me. I mean, I noticed on our guest list, we've got a few people that dialed in from sort of financial companies. You explained, you touched on it before about how LEIs can really help with financial transactions. But when you're looking at financial transactions either in country or cross border, I mean, what's the real power behind it? I mean, really, what's that real value add that, let's say, a corporate treasurer or an MLR analyst or somebody from within one of the financial institutions, especially in a high-risk jurisdiction, that we have in sub-Saharan Africa, say, listen, it's really worth you doing this because when you're doing this transaction, this is the power that it will give you.
Yeah. So
just to touch on one of the reasons I say that is often you'll see when people are making transactions out of band or coming out of a high jurisdiction place, typically it can be T+2, T+3. The transaction gets stopped on the way. It can be problematic, and it can obviously locks up very important cash flow for companies. Supplier payments go late. So what's that real value add that LEI will give you that will hopefully at least try and eliminate some of those bottlenecks that one experiences in the transaction flow?
So it essentially boils down to two different things. One would be the transparency. The LEI is the only globally transparent and usable that's actually usable data set that is standardized in G20 nations. The second part is being that because the LEI is almost that one-stop shop with a one global database that anyone can go and view and absorb and access, for an organization who are onboarding on multiple different countries and multiple different jurisdictions. They all have an individual process to onboard in each of those jurisdictions. They have different registries to check. They have different authoritative sources to check. Some of those registries might not even be public. They have to pay for all those documents, etc., etc. So essentially, these organizations can almost offset or outsource their client onboarding or counterparty verification to an LOU or an LEI issuer, and use the LEI data to trust that this information has already been validated and these documents have already been purchased. And basically it simplifies the organization to have one simple process across all of these different jurisdictions and countries, instead of having a complete muddle of going, here in this jurisdiction or here in that jurisdiction and so forth. So again, it's just driving standardization within the organization as well as globally.
Well, I think we're just approaching sort of time, and I think just very quickly in summary, then I think sort of key points that I've taken away from this. Number one, it's a global identifier. It cuts across a number of sort of compliance regulations and regulatory bodies. Therefore, by having an LEI or being LEI enabled, gives a lot of comfort to your counterparty. And also to regulatory authorities in those jurisdictions that you're a bona fide business. I think that's number one. Number two, increasingly with compliance, MLRO departments, that it also helps streamline your processes. It gives you the sort of level of comfort around standardization. And I think also to your counterparties, especially when you're establishing business connections, typically in trade, in other emerging markets or advanced markets, your LEI sort of reinforces your strength as a business, as a company. I think, as Ben mentioned earlier, at the beginning of this webinar, Cevian is very much focused on helping companies streamline their processes. We're very heavy on compliance. We're regulated fintech. We operate in the emerging markets as well as the advanced ones, and we very much want to help businesses be able to basically make their payments and enhance their treasury function. And we know a cornerstone of any of that really is around sort of compliance and regulation. And by working with ourselves and UbiSecure, we can hopefully help our customers with a more seamless compliance and transaction service, simply by giving comfort to the fact that you're LEI enabled. And if anybody on this call wants some further information, please don't hesitate to go to our website, www.cevian.co. We would be delighted to help you. We constantly speak to our customers. We're not aggressively pushing and forcing LEIs on people. We don't think that's the way to do it. We just think that it's an enhanced service that really will benefit your business, especially when you're trading. And I think finally, on behalf of Ben, myself, the Cevian team, Nathan, thank you and for your time and also your support that you've given us on this journey so far. And it was very easy to integrate onto your platform with the APIs, by the way. We were delighted with that. And we look forward to helping you sort of grow the ecosystem here in Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa. So on behalf of everybody at Cevian, and we thank all of our guests for taking the time to join this webinar. And as you can thank our partner as well. We've got a series of webinars coming up, which we will be sharing further information with with people who are interested. And we just look forward to the journey with yourselves and also with UbiSecure. So thank you very much, everybody. Any final comments or notes, Nathan or Ben, before we close this off?
No, just to say from our side, we really appreciate you hosting us today, and more than happy to work with you on future webinars.
Yeah, and we'll definitely have another webinar. Yeah, we'll look at something on crypto, perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps we'll see.
100%.
And
Definitely.
just to finalize from my side, a lot of the team here at Ubiscure post a lot of this information on our LinkedIns and so forth. So if you want a latest and up-to-date information, then feel free to go follow us and the Cevian team as well, because we're all driving the ecosystem forward.
Definitely. We're on LinkedIn as well. So yeah, we're delighted to touch base with you there. So thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate your time. Stay safe. And hopefully we look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully seeing you on another webinar in the near term. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.